Hey everybody. So today we're going to continue with our message from the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gives to his disciples and to his followers and to the people that were listening. And so today's verse comes from Matthew chapter 5 verse 4. It says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." So that's a really interesting verse there, because you think about mourning is a deep grief. You think of crying, and so you're thinking, how can somebody be blessed if they're in such pain, if they're in such a hard time, if they're grieving something? How is that a blessing? That doesn't make sense. Well, with Jesus, a lot of the things that he says doesn't make sense to our fleshly mind. It doesn't make sense at all times. Remember, we talked about how it's an upside down type of kingdom that Jesus comes and brings. And so he's giving this message to these people that are in a deep pain, a deep agony that they've probably have experienced being the people that they are. And we've talked about the context of the Jewish people and the oppression that they've felt, and the history of the Israelites. Their history is very much one of a deep mourning, and you can see that throughout the Old Testament. And so remember who Jesus is talking to here, that he's talking to Jewish people. He's talking to the nation of Israel. And so part of this history is, if you turn back to chapter 2, when Jesus was first born. So when Jesus was born, well, first of all, when he was preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, he was probably about 30 years old. And so you go back a couple chapters, and it's 30 years of history. And so when Jesus was born, there was a scene here where this king named King Herod heard about this new king that was about to be born, and he was called the King of the Jews. And so Herod heard about this news from these wise men, and King Herod didn't like that news. He felt a lot of jealousy, felt a lot of anger about that there would be a new king. He was the king, and so why was there this new king? So you can imagine how Herod must have felt angry and jealous. And so Herod did something completely wrong and evil. Is that in chapter 2 we see that that Jesus, when he was born, Herod ordered that all the sons that were 2 years old and younger were to be massacred, to be killed. And so it's a crazy scene here in the Bible that all these children under 2 years old were killed by this king. All these Jewish children were killed at that time. And so in chapter 2, it talks about that. In verse 18, there was this prophecy that was fulfilled when this happened. And it says, "A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be consoled or comforted, because they are no more." There's no more children. And so 30 years later, we see that Jesus is speaking. And what I thought was really interesting is that the crowd that he was speaking to was mixed with, men and women, and maybe even children were there. And so you have to imagine that in that nation, there was probably 30 years later, there was probably some of those mothers that lost children at that time, that they lost children when Jesus was born. They would have lost their son, and because of this birth of this king Jesus. And so these women were probably in the crowd when Jesus was sharing this message that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And I'm sure that a mother, even though it was 30 years ago, she's still facing the pain and the mourning of losing her baby. And so she sees this man up there speaking, and he's a 30-year-old male. And so in their hearts and their minds, they're thinking, man, if my child was still here, he would have been the same age as this man Jesus, who's sharing this message, who is proclaiming this kingdom. And they're probably putting the pieces together that, wow, when this guy was born, my child actually died because of his birth. And so that must have been a really hard emotional wrestling that these women were dealing with when they were hearing that Jesus was proclaiming this message that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And I'm wondering if they took that message, if they did feel comforted by the words of Jesus, and if they saw Jesus as that son of theirs, even if they saw that this king that caused them so much pain would actually come to also give them eternal comfort from that pain. And losing a child, must have been so difficult and so trying for these women. But standing in front of them was a king that would reward them, would give them eternal comfort. And so I'm wondering if they would have taken that trade, that pain, that's the temporary pain of losing someone and losing something so dear to you. I wonder if they would take that and take it with this comforting that was given to them through Jesus. And so that was a really fascinating part to the story that I read, and I thought kind of put those pieces together to think about that. And so along with this message of these babies being killed, it's exactly like when Moses was born in Exodus chapter 1 and 2, that when Moses was born, the same thing happened, that there was a king, there's a Pharaoh, that he ordered for all the babies of the Jewish people, the Israelites, that they would be killed because that nation was growing. And even Pharaoh actually took those people in slavery, the Israel people in slavery. But there's so many people that he got began to get a little bit nervous because he thought that they were going to overtake that nation. And so what Pharaoh did is he ordered for the babies to be killed. But then we see Moses that he was the one that escaped that because of his mother and because of the basket. You might know that story, that Moses was saved by his mother, and actually Pharaoh's daughter picked Moses up and began to raise him in the Pharaoh's home. But it's the similar story there. And remember, when Jesus steps onto the scene, he's stepping into this role as a new, better Moses. And so it's a pretty cool story there that we see. When Moses was born, there was babies that were born, and when Jesus was born, babies were born in two terrible events in Israel's history. And it's to show that that even through great pain, there was a greater outcome. When Moses was born, there was such great pain, but however, Moses was the one that God used to save the people from the oppression of Egypt and the Pharaoh. And when Jesus was born, there was such great pain that these women experienced, but he was born to save the nation of Israel, to save the people for a greater reward for all eternity of that comfort. And so I'm just thinking about those two stories, and thinking about the things that we go through in our lives, and the great pain that maybe you've experienced. And if you're not a Christ follower, pain doesn't seem to have any real purpose. There's just pain and trials, and it's difficult, and there doesn't seem to be any hope for people that don't have Jesus as their king. But if you do have Jesus as your king, then blessed are you who mourn, for you will be comforted. And it's not saying that if you're a Christian, you're not going to mourn anymore. No, if you're a Christian, there's still great mourning that's happening and great pain that happens, but there's a greater hope and a greater joy and a great comfort that you can experience even though you face pain and hard times and suffering. And so I want to encourage you with that as you follow Christ, know that the painful things that you experience in life, that you can still have hope, because your hope is in the eternal Christ, an eternal kingdom, an eternal God who gives joy, who gives comfort, who gives hope in what seems to be hopeless situations. And so be blessed with that word, and I hope that that you find hope and comfort in the words of Jesus, and just to walk away with that hope, encouragement, joy. And so be blessed with that. Love you guys, and I'll see you later.